The last eligible bachelor in Caldwell, Kansas, had exactly three things going for him in the autumn of 1882. A fine stretch of land along the Chikaskia River, a reputation for being the most honest horse trader west of Wichita, and a stubborn streak wide enough to build a barn on. His name was Eli Calloway, and he was 28 years old, lean as a fence post, with sun-bronzed skin and dark brown eyes that could read the weather in a horse's gait and the mood of a storm cloud with equal precision. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that jutted out of the Kansas bluffs, and hands that were rough enough to tell their own story without a single word being spoken. The women of Caldwell had long since given up on him, not because he was unkind, but because Eli Calloway seemed perfectly content in his solitude, which struck most of the matchmaking mothers in town as a kind of personal affront. Every married man in Caldwell, from old Sheriff Burl Dawson to the young barber Theodore Finch who had married just 6 months prior, had at some point pulled Eli aside and offered him some version of the same speech. Find yourself a good woman, Eli. Life is better with a partner beside you. You cannot run that ranch alone forever. Eli would nod, tip his hat, and ride on back to the Calloway spread, where his horse, a big gray quarter horse named Scout, was the only company he truly seemed to require. The town of Caldwell itself was no small place by 1882. It sat right on the Kansas Indian Territory border and served as one of the last great cattle shipping points on the Kishom Trail. Longhorns were driven up from Texas by the thousands, and the town had grown up fast and loud around that trade, with saloons and hotels and a proper telegraph office, and a train depot that had been the pride of the whole county since the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line had extended its reach down through the prairie. The depot was a wide, low building of rough-cut timber with a painted sign above the double doors that read Caldwell Station, and on most days it smelled of coal smoke and leather, and the particular tension of people arriving somewhere they had never been before. Eli had little use for the depot himself. He received his supplies by wagon from the general store, and the only time he had occasion to pass the building was when he rode down Main Street on his way to the stockyards or the feed merchant. He barely glanced at it on the Thursday morning in late September when he rode Scout into town to settle a debt with a rancher named Peterson and pick up a new pair of work gloves from Hargrave's general store. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of Kansas morning that made the whole endless prairie look like it was polished, every blade of brown grass catching the early light. Eli tied Scout outside the store, exchanged a few words with old Abel Hargrave about the recent cattle drive that had churned up the South Road, paid for his gloves, and was just stepping back out onto the boardwalk when he heard it. The train whistle, long and low, rolling across the flat land like a sound that belonged to the earth itself. Nothing unusual in that. The southbound came through every Thursday, and the eastbound from Wichita passed through on Mondays and Thursdays as well. Eli pulled on one of his new gloves and was reaching for Scout's reins when he heard the commotion from down the street. A voice, sharp and clear, and carrying the unmistakable ring of someone who was not particularly frightened but was absolutely, completely lost. "This is not Dodge City." He turned. Standing on the platform of the depot, surrounded by 3 leather traveling trunks and a worn carpet bag, was a young woman who looked like she had arrived from an entirely different world than the one Caldwell occupied. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark auburn hair that had mostly escaped whatever pins had been meant to hold it, and was now curling in wild strands around her face in the prairie wind. She wore a deep blue traveling dress that had seen better days, the hem dusty from the train, and she stood with her hands on her hips surveying the town of Caldwell with an expression that was equal parts dismay and determination. Eli watched as the station master, a round little man named Floyd Cutter, spread his hands apologetically and said something that made the woman's expression shift from dismay to outright disbelief. "Wrong train," she said, loudly enough that it carried down the street. A few people stopped to look. One of the cowboys lounging outside the saloon laughed. Eli found himself walking in the direction of the depot before he had consciously decided to do so, which was the kind of thing that would only make sense to him later, much later, when he had the benefit of knowing how the whole story was going to unfold. He stepped up onto the platform and Floyd Cutter, clearly relieved to see a respectable face, gestured toward him as though presenting a solution. "Miss," Floyd said, "this here is Eli Calloway. He is one of our most upstanding citizens. Perhaps he can be of some assistance while we sort out your situation." The woman turned and looked at Eli with eyes that were a startling shade of green, the color of the river grass in early spring. She did not look particularly reassured by Floyd's endorsement. "I am Eleanor Voss," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I was supposed to be on the train to Dodge City. I'm supposed to be meeting my employer there by Saturday. I got on the wrong train in Wichita." "How does a person get on the wrong train?" Eli asked, because it was the honest question at the front of his mind. Eleanor Voss blinked. It was clear she had expected sympathy before interrogation. The trains were on adjacent tracks, and the platform announcements were given simultaneously, and the conductor on this train assured me I was on the correct one. That conductor was, it appears, mistaken. Eli looked at Floyd, who gave a small, helpless shrug. "The next eastbound back to Wichita does not leave until Monday," Floyd said quietly. "Monday," Eleanor repeated, as though the word were a small disaster. "That is 4 days." "There are accommodations at the Drover's Rest Hotel," Eli said. "It is a decent establishment." Eleanor looked down the length of Main Street at the Drover's Rest Hotel, which was a 2-story frame building with a porch full of dusty cowboys playing cards and a sign that was missing 2 letters. Her expression was not encouraging. "It will do," she said finally, with the kind of composure that Eli recognized immediately as the product of someone who had learned to make the best of things, not by nature, but by considerable practice. He helped her carry the trunks, because there was no way not to, because Floyd Cutter's back had been going out all autumn and there was nobody else on the platform. Eleanor carried the carpet bag herself, despite Eli's offer to take it as well, holding it close to her side as though it contained something she was not prepared to trust to a stranger. They walked down Main Street side by side, which caused exactly the amount of small-town attention Eli had anticipated, which was to say, considerable. Mrs. Hargrave appeared in the door of the general store. Old Pete from the livery shaded his eyes. The cowboys on the Drover's Rest porch straightened up like prairie dogs spotting something interesting. "They are staring," Eleanor observed. "They are," Eli agreed. "Is it because of me or because of you?" Eli considered this. "Probably both. I am not usually seen walking alongside a lady. Is that unusual for you?" "Extremely." She glanced at him sideways as they stepped up onto the hotel porch, and there was something in that glance that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to one to be interesting. The cowboys on the porch moved aside with various degrees of courtesy, and one swept his hat off entirely, which made Eleanor give a small, genuine laugh, soft and sudden, like a bird flushing from tall grass. Eli got her settled with the hotel proprietor, a widow named Mrs. Garland, who ran the Drover's Rest with the efficiency of a military operation and the warmth of a grandmother, which made the combination more reassuring than the peeling sign had suggested. Mrs. Garland clucked over Eleanor like she was a wayward chick, took her bags from Eli with brisk authority, and said she would have a proper supper sent up, and that Miss Voss was not to worry about a thing. Eli stood in the hotel lobby for a moment after Mrs. Garland had bustled Eleanor upstairs. He turned his hat in his hands, which was something he did when he was thinking more than he intended to. He was not sure what he was thinking about exactly. He told himself it was only that he felt a responsibility for seeing that a stranded woman had been properly placed, which was a thing any decent man would feel. He went back to Scout, untied him, and rode home. He thought about those green eyes almost the entire way. The next morning was a Friday, and Eli had work to do. Fence line on the north pasture that had been sending him messages in the form of loose posts for 2 weeks, and he was not the kind of man to let his thoughts interfere with his responsibilities. He was out on the range by sunup with a post digger and a coil of wire, and he worked steady and hard through the cool morning, and he was only halfway finished when it occurred to him that he had not eaten since breakfast. He rode back to the barn to eat something from the kitchen and found himself, with no particular intention, saddling Scout again an hour later and riding into Caldwell. He told himself he needed more staples from the feed merchant. The feed merchant was closed on Fridays because old Hank Dresser was a strict observer of his own particular version of the Sabbath, which he kept from Friday noon to Saturday noon for reasons he had explained at length once, and which no one had fully understood. Eli stood outside the closed feed merchant for a moment, and then, because he was at least honest with himself, he walked to the Drover's Rest. Eleanor Voss was not in the hotel. Mrs. Garland informed him, with the pleased expression of a woman who was already constructing a narrative she liked very much, that Miss Voss had gone out for a walk. In Caldwell, in September, that meant she was either on Main Street or down toward the river, because those were the two directions from the hotel that did not lead immediately into the open prairie. He found her by the river. She was sitting on a flat rock at the bank of the Chikaskia with her shoes off and her feet in the water, which at this time of year was shallow and cold and running clear over the limestone gravel. She had a small notebook in her lap, and she was writing in it with a pencil stub. Her hair fully escaped now from any attempt at formal arrangement, blowing loose and red-dark in the wind off the prairie. She heard him coming through the cottonwood trees and looked up without alarm. "Mr. Calloway," she said, as though she had been expecting him, which both pleased and unsettled him in equal measure. "Miss Voss," he said, "I wanted to make sure you were settled and all right." "I am settled and all right," she said, which was stated not unkindly but with enough precision that he understood she was aware it was not entirely the reason he had come. "Sit down if you like." He sat down on the bank near the rock, pulling his knees up and resting his forearms on them, looking out at the river. It was a peaceful stretch of water, and he had spent a considerable part of his boyhood along it, first with his father and later alone after his father had died of a fever in the winter of 1873. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Letters," she said. "I owe several people explanations for my current whereabouts. What sort of employer are you meeting in Dodge City?" She was quiet for a moment, and he wondered if he had been too direct. People in the East, he had heard, moved more carefully around questions than the people of the frontier, where directness was less a personality trait than a practical survival strategy. "I am to be a schoolteacher," she said finally. "The Dodge City School Board wrote to my college in Ohio and arranged for a teaching position. I graduated in June, and I spent the summer settling my family affairs in Columbus before making the journey." "What kind of family affairs?" She looked at him for a moment, gauging something. "My father passed away in July. He was my only family. I needed to see to his estate, which was modest, and arrange for the house to be sold. That took longer than anticipated, which is why I left Ohio so late in the season." "I am sorry," Eli said, and he meant it with the weight of someone who understood exactly what it was to lose the last person who made a place feel like home. Something in his tone communicated that weight, and Eleanor looked at him with a different quality of attention. "Have you lost people too?" she asked. "My father, 10 years ago now, my mother when I was very small. I was raised partly by my father and partly by the land itself, I suppose. That is a lonely way to grow up. I did not think of it as lonely at the time. The land does not feel like an absence when you are in it. It feels like a presence. But I understand now, as a grown man, that I miss things most people have." Eleanor set her notebook down and looked at the river for a moment. "My father was a quiet man, but a kind one. He believed that women had as much right to education and useful work as men, which was not a universal view in Columbus. He encouraged me to take every course I was permitted to take and then to petition for the ones I was not. Was that difficult, the petitioning? It was the most useful education I received, she said, and there was a smile in it now, real and warm. Eli found he was smiling too, which surprised him. Not because he was a humorless man, but because smiling had become over the years something he did alone, out on the range with Scout or sitting on the porch at dusk watching the prairie light change color, not something that happened in response to another person. They sat by the river for 2 hours. They talked about Ohio and Kansas, about cattle and schoolhouses, about the way the prairie looked in every season and what it was like to be new to a place and what it was like to never have left one. Eli told her about the ranch, about the Chikaskia bottomland, and the way the wildflowers came up in April, and the way the winters could be savage and beautiful in the same hour. Eleanor told him about the college, about the professors who had been dismissive, and the 1 or 2 who had been genuinely encouraging, about her father's small garden behind the Columbus house, and the roses he had grown with improbable success in a city that was not particularly inclined toward roses. When the afternoon light shifted toward evening, and the air off the river turned cold, Eleanor put her shoes back on and stood and shook out her skirt and said, "Thank you for finding me, Mr. Calloway. This was better than sitting in the hotel. I could show you more of the area tomorrow if you would like," Eli said, and then immediately felt the particular vulnerability of a person who has said an honest thing to someone whose answer matters more than it should. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I would like that," she said. He rode home in the dusk with Scout moving easy and comfortable beneath him and the first stars coming out over the prairie, and something sitting in his chest that he could not have named precisely, but that felt, very much, like the beginning of something. Saturday arrived with a bright hard blue sky and a wind from the northwest that smelled of coming autumn. Eli arrived at the drover's rest at 9 in the morning driving his wagon, which he had cleaned out and put a proper seat board in, because Scout was not exactly suited for carrying a passenger, and a wagon was more practical, and that was the only reason, he told himself, that he had taken the time. Eleanor came out of the hotel in a dress that was simpler than the traveling one, a light gray cotton with a darker gray sash, and she had her hair braided back practically, and she carried a small basket that Mrs. Garland had apparently pressed upon her containing biscuits and dried fruit and a jar of cold coffee. She looked at the wagon and at Eli with his hat in his hands, and she said, "Good morning," with a warmth that made the whole of Main Street look a little brighter. They drove south along the river road with the cottonwoods going yellow at the edges and the big sky doing what the Kansas sky did in September, which was to be so enormous and so deeply blue that it made a person feel small and included at the same time, the way being part of something vast sometimes did. Eli showed her the place where the river bent and the limestone bluffs came down to meet the water, creating a sheltered pool where the fishing was excellent and the cottonwoods were oldest and biggest. He showed her the prairie dog town on the rise to the east, which made her laugh at the sentinels popping up and diving back down in their perpetual alarm. He showed her the Calloway land, and after a moment of hesitation, the ranch itself. The house was a solid 2-story frame structure that his father had built in 1868, not large but well made, with a good deep porch and windows on 3 sides to catch the light and the breeze. It needed painting, and the porch railing had a section that wanted replacing, and the kitchen garden had gone to weeds since late summer, but it was a real house with good bones, and Eleanor walked through it with a quiet attention that was not judgment but something closer to imagination, the way a person walked through a space when they were picturing what it could be. "You live here alone?" she asked, standing in the kitchen. "Just me," he said. "And Scout, who considers himself a member of the household but sleeps in the barn." She smiled at that and ran her hand along the edge of the pine kitchen table that his father had built. "It is a good house," she said. "It would be a very good house with some flowers in the front." "I have attempted flowers twice," Eli said. They did not survive me. Perhaps they needed better instruction, she said. They ate Mrs. Garland's biscuits on the porch and drank the cold coffee and looked out over the Chikaskia bottomland to the west, where the light was making long gold shadows through the grass. The wind had settled somewhat, and it was warm enough in the sun that Eleanor had taken off the light shawl she had worn and let the sun fall on her arms. Eli found himself looking at her with the frank, honest attention of a man who has spent too many years looking at nothing but land and horses and realizing, only now, that he has been missing a particular kind of beauty that the land and horses could not provide. "You mentioned you are going to Dodge City," he said, because he felt the weight of it sitting between them, and he was not a man who could comfortably ignore weights. "The train Monday," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that was not precisely unhappy but was not simple either. "Dodge City is a different kind of town," he said. "It was the cattle shipping point before Caldwell took over most of that trade. It is louder and rougher. I am not particularly easily frightened," Eleanor said. "No," he agreed. "I can see that." She looked at him. "What are you trying to say, Mr. Calloway?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat brim in his hands in the way he did when he was being more honest than comfortable. "I suppose I am trying to say that Caldwell also has children who need schooling. We have had a schoolteacher since spring, but she married in August and left with her husband for Colorado. The school board has been trying to arrange someone new since September." Eleanor was still looking at him, and there was something careful and interested in it. "That is a remarkable coincidence," she said. "It may be," he said. "Are you on the school board, Mr. Calloway?" "No, but I know the men who are." She was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle above the far pasture with the easy mastery of something that had been doing exactly this for its entire life. Then she said, "A person does not simply change their employment arrangements on the basis of a pleasant Saturday afternoon." "No," he said, "they do not. It would require careful thought and proper communication with the Dodge City School Board." "Of course. And it would require speaking with the Caldwell School Board to determine whether there is an actual position available. That could be arranged quite quickly, I believe." Eleanor looked at him, and the careful expression shifted into something softer and more honest. "You have known me for 2 days, Mr. Calloway." "I have," he said. "I am aware that is not long. And yet you are suggesting I stay." "I am suggesting you consider it," he said, "as a practical matter, given that Caldwell has need of a schoolteacher." She held his gaze for another moment, and then she looked back out over the prairie, and whatever she was thinking kept her quiet for a while. The hawk had gone higher and further south. The bottomland grass was moving in a slow wave. After a while she said, without looking at him, "When could I meet the school board?" Eli spent Sunday morning collecting school board members. Caldwell's school board consisted of 3 men: Reverend James Aldrich, who ran the Methodist church on the north end of Main Street; Thomas Perkins, who owned the town's biggest general goods operation and had 4 children of school age; and a former Texas rancher named Cole Hatch, who had settled outside town 5 years ago and had opinions about everything, including education, which were delivered at considerable volume but were not unkind. Eli found all 3 of them before noon and explained the situation, which required some delicacy because he did not want to give the impression that he had personally recruited a schoolteacher for personal reasons, which was in fact exactly what he had done, though he was still working out how to think about that himself. Reverend Aldrich said immediately that it sounded like Providence at work, which was the Reverend's explanation for most things. Thomas Perkins said he would like to speak with the young woman before making any commitments. Cole Hatch said, "She rode all the way from Ohio alone." Good. Anyone who can manage that can manage 30 Kansas schoolchildren without any trouble. The meeting took place Sunday afternoon in the school building itself, a solid single-room structure with a proper floor and 8 rows of desks, and a blackboard that Thomas Perkins had ordered special from Kansas City. Eleanor came with her credentials from the Ohio College, and a calm, clear manner that Eli watched from the back of the room with the particular pride of someone who is not entirely sure what they are proud of, but feels it strongly. She answered Thomas Perkins' questions precisely. She engaged Reverend Aldrich about curriculum with genuine enthusiasm. She told Cole Hatch that yes, she had ridden on the train alone and had managed perfectly well until the conductor in Wichita had been misinformed, and that she expected Kansas schoolchildren to be no more challenging than Ohio ones, which produced a bark of laughter from Hatch that warmed the room considerably. By the end of the afternoon, the Caldwell School Board had offered Eleanor Voss a teaching position with a salary of $40 per month, which was a reasonable wage by 1882 standards, along with a small private room in the boarding house run by the Aldrich family connected to the church, which was a good clean place that would suit a professional woman. Eleanor said she would give her answer by Monday morning, because she felt the right thing was to send a telegraph to the Dodge City School Board and explain the situation honestly before committing to any change. Eli drove her back to the drover's rest in the wagon, and when they pulled up in front of the hotel he said, "Whatever you decide, Miss Voss, you should know it has been a genuine pleasure." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment in the late afternoon light, the October sun going copper and low over the edge of the prairie. "It has been a genuine pleasure for me as well, Mr. Calloway," she said. And then she said, "I think I may stay." She sent the telegraph to Dodge City that evening. The Dodge City School Board replied Monday morning with a terseness that was partly disappointment and partly relief, as they had found another candidate the previous week and had been uncertain how to proceed with the communication. It resolved cleanly, and Eleanor felt the easing of that particular weight immediately. She accepted the Caldwell position Monday morning and moved into the Aldrich boarding house Monday afternoon, which meant she did not, in fact, take the eastbound train that arrived at Caldwell Station that day at 11 o'clock, which was the train she had been planning to take back to Wichita to reroute herself properly to Dodge City. Eli happened to be at the station when the eastbound came in, on entirely legitimate business involving a letter he needed to dispatch to a cattle buyer in Wichita. He told himself this as he stood on the platform and watched the train come in and stop and discharge 3 passengers and take on 2 and pull away, and he felt, watching it go, a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the cattle buyer. October settled over Caldwell with a gold and amber permanence, the cottonwoods along the river going brilliant yellow, the grass on the prairie turning the deep copper red of autumn, the big sky shifting from summer's hard blue to something softer and more complex. The cattle drives were winding down for the season, and the cowboys who had been through all summer were mostly gone now, heading south with the last of the herds or dispersing into winter work. The town felt quieter, more like itself. Eleanor Voss opened the Caldwell School on the first Monday of October with 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and an energy that the children felt immediately, and that their parents reported at supper tables all over town with a uniform approval. Eli did not see her often in those first weeks, not because he did not want to, but because he was not sure what the proper protocol was. A rancher could not simply drop in on the schoolteacher on a Tuesday afternoon without giving the town's considerable gossip apparatus an enormous amount of material, and he was sufficiently aware of his own feelings by now to know that he did not want Eleanor Voss to become the subject of speculation that might make her uncomfortable, or make her feel that staying in Caldwell had come with complications she had not signed up for. So he was circumspect. He spoke to her when he saw her in town, which was most Saturday mornings when she came to Hargrave's for supplies, and most Sunday evenings when he attended the Methodist church service, with the slightly increased frequency that he told himself had nothing to do with the Aldrich boarding house being 2 doors from the church. But it was a small town, and small towns have their own logic, and that logic pressed them together in ways that were not engineered by either of them. It was Cole Hatch who did it first, in his direct and unintrusive way, by inviting both of them to the autumn harvest supper at the Hatch Ranch on the second Saturday of October, along with what appeared to be most of the surrounding county. Eli arrived on scout to find Eleanor already there with the Aldrich family, standing in a ring of light from the big bonfire that the Hatch family had built in the yard, talking to Mrs. Hatch and three other women with the ease of someone who had been part of the community for years rather than 2 weeks. She was wearing a deep red dress he had not seen before, and her hair was up in a way that was more formal than the usual practical arrangement. And when she saw him across the fire, her face changed in a way that was very small and very clear to anyone who happened to be watching, which, unfortunately for both of them, included Mrs. Garland from the hotel, Mrs. Hargrave from the general store, and Reverend Aldrich's wife, all three of whom exchanged a look of such complete mutual understanding that an entire conversation was conducted without a single word. Eli walked around the fire toward her. She met him halfway, which was perhaps not entirely accidental. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Voss," he said, "you look well." "I am well," she said. "I enjoy the school enormously. The children are bright and the range of their knowledge is remarkable. One 12-year-old boy can tell you everything about cattle breeding and cannot identify any of the state capitals." "That sounds about right for this part of Kansas," he said. She laughed, and it was that same sudden warm laugh he had heard on the hotel porch the first day, the one that came out like something that had been held in and found a gap. They talked all evening, working their way around the fire and through the tables of food, and eventually ending up at the edge of the Hatch yard where the dark began, and the prairie opened out wide and dark around them, the stars extraordinary above the flat land, thick and present in a way they never were back east where the towns had enough light to push them back. Eleanor looked up at the stars the way a person looks at something they keep discovering is bigger than they thought. "The sky here," she said. "It does not do that in Ohio." "The sky is everywhere the same size," Eli said. "It just looks bigger when there is nothing else tall enough to compete with it." She looked at him with a quality of attention he was beginning to recognize as specific to her, a focused, genuine interest that made a person feel that whatever they had just said was worth saying. "That is a very good way of thinking about it," she said. "My father said it. He had a gift for that kind of thing, the short sentence that holds a large idea. You must have learned it from him." Eli was quiet for a moment, and then he said, more honestly than he had planned, "I miss him still. Not with the same sharp quality as before, but it is still there. Like a fence post that is not there anymore, but the ground still shows where it was." Eleanor put her hand on his arm, just briefly, the lightest touch, and said nothing, because she understood that some things do not want words put on them. They only want acknowledgement. And that brief touch, that completely simple gesture, went through Eli Calloway like a current, not dramatic and not shattering, but deep and clean and reaching places that had been unaware of their own temperature until something warmer made the contrast clear. November arrived with its first hard frost in the first week, and with it, the news that there would be a Thanksgiving dance in the town hall, which was the event of the social season in Caldwell, and which everyone attended and which historically produced at least one marriage proposal, several reconciliations, and an argument between the two families who each claimed their recipe for pecan pie was the superior one. Eli asked Eleanor if she would attend the dance with him on a Wednesday afternoon in the first week of November, stopping her on the boardwalk outside the post office where she had gone to collect a package of school books she had ordered from a publisher in Kansas City. He asked her with the directness that was his natural register, looking her straight in the eye and turning his hat brim in his hands. "I would like to take you to the Thanksgiving dance," he said, "if you are agreeable." Eleanor held her package of school books against her chest and looked at him. The November air was cold and smelled of wood smoke from all the chimneys on Main Street, and her cheeks were pink with it, and her eyes were very green in the pale light. "Are you asking me as a courtesy call or as something more deliberate than that?" she said. He liked that she asked the honest question. He gave her the honest answer, As something more deliberate, he said. She studied him for a moment longer, and he could see her thinking, not with doubt but with the careful seriousness of someone who did not make decisions lightly. Then yes, she said, I would like to go. He walked home that afternoon with his hat on and his coat open despite the cold, which was not something he would have been able to explain to anyone who asked but which made perfect sense to him in the moment. The weeks between that Wednesday and the Thanksgiving dance were weeks of a kind that Eli had not experienced before, a slow and mutual discovery of two people who were learning each other in the incremental, careful way that people do when they are aware that what is building between them matters. They had supper together on Friday evenings at the hotel restaurant, which Mrs. Garland took as a personal triumph, and which she commemorated by always giving them the table by the window with the good view of the street. They walked together on Sunday afternoons along the river road when the weather permitted, with the cottonwood leaves all down now, and the river gone low and dark, and the prairie standing in its winter austerity, beautiful in the particular way that stripped-back things are beautiful. Eleanor talked about her students with a love that was evident in everything, in the way she used their names, in the small stories she brought back from the school each Friday. The boy who had finally understood fractions and been so excited he had shouted it, which she had pretended to reprimand, but had not felt reprimanded about at all. The girl from the Newcomb farm who read so fast Eleanor was writing to publishers for more advanced material. The three youngest students who still had not managed to sit still for more than 20 minutes and probably never would entirely, but whose interest in the natural world she was trying to harness rather than suppress. Eli listened to all of it with the attentiveness of a man who finds that someone's happiness is interesting to him, in a way that makes the whole world feel slightly more interesting overall. He told her about the ranch in the same careful detail, the decisions he made about the herd and why, the mathematics of cattle breeding and feed and market prices that most people found dull, but that she listened to with genuine engagement, asking questions that were not polite approximations of interest but real questions about how things worked. "You love it," she said one Sunday, the two of them walking the south fence line of the Calloway range because she had said she wanted to see the whole of it, which had struck him as such an unusual and thoroughly pleasing request that he had organized the walk immediately. "What?" he said. "The land, the whole operation of it. You love it the way I love the school. It is not merely your livelihood, it is your life." "It is," he said. "I have tried to picture myself doing anything else and I cannot make the picture work." "I cannot make a different picture of myself either," she said. "Teaching is what I was made for. I know that sounds dramatic." "It sounds true," he said. She smiled at that, looking out over the winter-brown range with the wind pulling at the loose strands of hair around her face. They were standing at the highest point of the south fence, where the land gave a long, slow view north all the way to town and south to the Indian Territory line, and the whole of the November prairie was spread around them in its big, honest, windswept silence. "This is an extraordinary place," Eleanor said quietly. "It is," Eli said, and he was not entirely sure whether he was answering about the land or about the moment. He was entirely sure, standing there in the wind with her beside him, that he was in love with Eleanor Voss. Not in the sudden, unbalancing way of novels, but in the deep, recognizing way of someone who has found something he did not know he was looking for and knows it immediately for what it is. He did not say any of this yet. He waited. The Thanksgiving dance was on the 23rd of November, which fell on a Thursday that year, and Caldwell prepared for it with the focused communal enthusiasm of a town that understood the value of celebrations. The town hall, which was a large wooden building with a proper floor built for exactly this kind of occasion, was strung with lanterns and decorated with the dried corn and gourds that several of the farm families had contributed, and someone had hauled in bales of hay to sit on at the edges, and the whole effect was warm and amber and smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of fresh-baked pies lined up on the long table along the south wall. Eli arrived at the Aldrich boarding house at 7 o'clock with his best coat brushed clean, and his boots polished to a shine, and his hair combed with a precision that Scout had observed from the stall with evident curiosity. He knocked on the door, and Mrs. Aldrich opened it with a smile of such delight that he felt slightly ambushed by it. Eleanor came downstairs in a dress he had not seen before, a deep green wool that was the same shade as the river grass in April and the exact color of her eyes, and he understood in that moment that the dress was not an accident. She had a small garnet brooch at the neckline that had been her mother's, and her hair was done beautifully, loosely up with curling strands escaping around her face exactly as they always did, and which she no longer fought against because the wind always won anyway. "You look beautiful," Eli said, and it came out without the slight roughness of a man not sure he has the right, because he was sure. Eleanor looked at him with those green eyes and said, "You look very handsome, Mr. Calloway," and there was something in it that was warmth and humor and honesty all at once, which was, he had learned, exactly her register. They walked to the town hall together, and the evening was cold and brilliant, the stars out early over the dark prairie, their breath making small clouds in the air, and they walked close enough that, when his arm occasionally touched hers, it was noted and not corrected. The town hall was full and loud and warm, and the fiddle player, a wiry old man called Red Hayes who had come from somewhere in Missouri at some point in the previous decade, was already going at a pace that had a dozen couples moving on the floor. The smell of food and cedar, and the particular warmth of many people gathered in a winter building, was deeply comfortable and alive. Eli and Eleanor found Cole Hatch and his wife Martha immediately, which meant they were immediately in the middle of a conversation about the school and the spring cattle season, and whether the railroad was going to extend its line further south before next summer. And it was warm and easy, and Eleanor held her own in every direction of the conversation, which Eli watched with a steady and particular pleasure. Then Red Hayes struck up a waltz. Cole Hatch gave his wife a look of theatrical suffering, and Martha Hatch pulled him onto the floor with the authority of a woman who had been managing Cole Hatch for 20 years and found it entertaining. Eli turned to Eleanor. "Would you dance?" he asked. "I would," she said, and she put her hand in his. He had danced before at previous harvest suppers and town events, but it had always been the polite, functional dancing of a man fulfilling a social expectation. This was different, and he knew it was different the moment he put his hand at her waist and felt her other hand on his shoulder, and they began to move through the waltz with the ease of two people who found each other, very simply, comfortable. She was a good dancer, light and responsive, and she looked up at him with an expression that was open and warm, and without any of the careful measuring that he had noticed in the early days, the first 2 days when she had still been a stranger assessing a strange place and a strange man. That was gone now, replaced by something that was trust and interest, and he thought, something much closer to the same feeling that was sitting in his own chest tonight like a coal burning steady and sure. They danced twice and then stood at the edge of the floor eating pie and talking to anyone who drifted close, and then danced again, and somewhere in the middle of the evening, Eli found himself holding Eleanor's hand not for the dance, but simply because they were walking to get more cider and neither of them let go. And she did not let go, and neither did he. They were standing near the door at the end of the evening, the party winding down and the children all asleep on the hay bales, and the older couples sitting in comfortable, tired conversation, when Eli said the thing he had been building toward for weeks, not with a speech, but with the same directness he applied to everything in his life. "Eleanor," he said. He had not used her given name before. She noticed it immediately. "Yes," she said, and she was looking at him with complete attention. "I want you to know that what I feel for you is serious," he said. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean, and I am not a man who works slowly toward an intention. I intend, if you are willing, to court you properly and honestly, with marriage in mind." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment in the amber light of the thinning lanterns, with the fiddle going soft in the background and the cold air from the cracked door behind them. Then she said, "Eli, I arrived in Caldwell on the wrong train." "You did," he said. "I have thought about that quite a lot," she said. "I'm a person who believes in reason and cause and the practical explanation for things. But I have had a difficult time applying that framework to the fact that I got on a wrong train in Wichita and arrived in the one town in Kansas that needed a schoolteacher and had the one man in it who I believe I could spend a life with." He was very still. "Are you saying yes?" he asked. "I am saying," she said carefully, "that I would very much like to be courted properly and honestly by you, Eli Calloway, with marriage in mind." He took both her hands and held them and looked at her with everything plain on his face, which was not a thing he had allowed before with another person, and she looked back at him with the same openness. And in the cold draft from the cracked door at the end of the Caldwell Town Hall with red haze playing something slow and sweet in the background, that was the beginning of it, the real beginning. The thing that had been building since a platform and a set of leather trunks and a woman's voice saying this is not Dodge City. December in Kansas was the month that showed you what you were made of. The wind came down from the north with a kind of personal conviction, and the temperature dropped to a seriousness that was not abstract. And the prairie, which had been beautiful in its autumn austerity, became beautiful in an entirely different and more demanding register. The sky was low and gray most days, and the cottonwoods stood bare and black along the river, and the snow, when it came in sheets across the flat land with no trees or hills to stop it. Eli's ranch in December required full attention. The herd had been reduced at the November market, the older animals sold so that the winter feeding burden on the remaining stock was manageable, but there were still 40 head to check and feed, and tend to in conditions that did not care about convenience. He was up before dawn every morning and out until dark most evenings, and the work was physical and cold and relentless, and he did it with the competence of someone who had done it for many years. But this winter he came back to the cold, dark house each evening with a different quality of awareness of its emptiness. He and Eleanor saw each other on Friday evenings still, which required him to come in from the ranch and clean up and be at the hotel restaurant by 6 o'clock, and on Sunday afternoons, when the weather permitted something other than simply staying close to a heat source, and on Sunday evenings at church. They wrote to each other sometimes during the week, short notes passed through Abel Hargrave at the general store, who served as an unofficial postal system for the two of them, and who took this responsibility with great seriousness and no small amount of personal satisfaction. Eleanor's notes were precise and funny and full of the school and her students, and her observations about winter on the prairie, which she approached with the same direct curiosity she brought to everything. As though the Kansas winter was a large, interesting problem, she intended to understand fully rather than simply endure. Eli's notes were shorter, not because he had less to say, but because he expressed himself more readily in person than on paper, and he was aware of this limitation, and stated it plainly in the first note he ever sent, which made Eleanor write back that she found the gap between what he said in person and what he managed on paper charming, and that he should not worry about it. On the Friday before Christmas, Eli arrived at the hotel restaurant with something in his coat pocket that he had been carrying around for 4 days while he worked out his timing. It was a small silver ring that had been his mother's, simple and plain, with a small dark garnet that his father had told him had come from somewhere in Georgia before the family had moved west. He had found it in the small cedar box in the back of the house closet where his father had kept the few things that mattered most, and he had cleaned it carefully and carried it ever since. He almost did not do it that evening, because it was only December and they had been courting less than 2 months, and he was aware that by certain social standards this was moving with some speed. But he was also aware that he was a man who trusted his own judgment in most things, who read land and livestock, and weather with a precision that came from honest attention. And he had given Eleanor Voss the same honest attention, and his judgment was clear. They ate supper and talked about Christmas and the school's end-of-term exhibition that Eleanor's students were preparing, which involved a nativity play and a spelling competition and 3 recitations. And Eli listened and laughed and was entirely present in it. And when Mrs. Garland had cleared their plates and brought coffee and left them to the window table with the discretion she had developed over the past 6 weeks, he reached into his coat pocket. "I have something for you," he said. Eleanor looked at his hand and at the small ring in his palm and at his face, and she was very still. "This was my mother's," he said. "I want you to have it because I want to marry you, Eleanor, and I am not a man who is good at long approaches to things he knows clearly." She looked at the ring for a long moment, and her eyes were very bright. "We have known each other for less than 3 months," she said, not as an objection but as a fact she was holding up to the light to examine. "We have," he said, "but some things you know with the same certainty whether you have had 3 months or 3 years. I know the land I am standing on by its feel underfoot. I do not need to have stood on it for a decade to know it. I know you, Eleanor. I know the kind of person you are, and the way you think, and the things that matter to you, and the things that make you laugh, and the things that you carry quietly that you do not speak of easily. I know that I want to spend the rest of my life learning the parts I do not know yet." The brightness in her eyes sharpened and overflowed. A single tear tracked down her cheek and she did not wipe it away. "Yes," she said. "Eli, yes." He put the ring on her finger and her hand was warm in both of his. Outside the window of the Drovers' Rest Hotel the December night was very dark and very cold, and the wind was moving along Main Street, the way it always did, steady and purposeful. And inside the ring of light at the window table by the street, Eli Calloway and Eleanor Voss were engaged, and Mrs. Garland, who had an excellent view of the window table from the kitchen pass-through, pressed her hand to her mouth and then went to find her husband to tell him immediately. The news was through the town by Sunday. It produced a universal response that was, by every measure, approval. Cole Hatch said he had seen it coming from the first day when Eli had shown up at the depot to help with the trunks, which was not a thing Eli had done, unprompted, in the preceding decade. Reverend Aldrich said it was the most straightforward example of providence he had witnessed in years, which given his framework was considerable praise. The matchmaking mothers of Caldwell, who had spent years failing to interest Eli in any of their candidates, found that they were not even slightly irritated by the outcome, because Eleanor Voss was exactly the right woman, and everyone who had observed the two of them together understood this simply and completely. They set the wedding for the first Saturday of March 1883, which gave them 3 months, and which Eleanor said was more than adequate time to arrange things, and Eli agreed, privately noting that 3 months was 2 months and 3 weeks longer than he required, but understanding that a wedding involved more people than just the two getting married, and was accordingly a more complex logistical matter. December was Christmas and the school exhibition, which Eli attended in the front row with Cole and Martha Hatch and Reverend Aldrich and his wife, and which was the finest school exhibition anyone in Caldwell could remember, including the nativity play in which the boy who had shouted about fractions played Joseph with a dignity that suggested he was taking the role extremely seriously. And the girl from the Newcomb farm delivered a recitation of 3 stanzas of Longfellow with a precision and depth of feeling that made 3 grown adults cry, including Cole Hatch, who denied it afterward and claimed his eyes were bothered by the candle smoke. After the exhibition, Eleanor stood in the school doorway in the cold, with a lantern behind her receiving the families as they left, and Eli waited until everyone else had gone in, and then put his arm around her shoulders and said, "That was magnificent." And she leaned into him and said, "They worked so hard." And the pride and love in her voice when she talked about those children was one of the most beautiful things Eli had ever been near. January was work and cold, and the slow, deep, satisfying labor of two people planning a life together, making the practical decisions that were the architecture of a shared future. Eleanor would continue teaching after the marriage, which was not universally conventional but which the Caldwell School Board, after a brief discussion, endorsed without objection, because Colhatch had told Thomas Perkins and Reverend Aldrich that Miss Voss was the finest teacher the school had ever had, and that only an idiot would lose that for the sake of convention. And while this was delivered in Colhatch's particular style, the content was persuasive. They talked about the house. Eli's house had been a bachelor's house for a decade, and needed the kind of attention that a person gives a space when they intend to actually live in it, rather than simply occupy it. Eleanor had opinions about this that were practical and thoughtful, and not extravagant, and they spent several Sunday afternoons walking through the rooms discussing what was needed and what could wait, and what might be done with materials available in Caldwell versus ordered from Wichita. She wanted curtains in the kitchen, real ones, and a proper bookshelf in the sitting room because she had boxes of books that had been in storage since Columbus. She wanted the kitchen garden reclaimed in spring and planted properly, vegetables and some herbs, and in the flower bed by the front porch, roses, because her father had grown them in Columbus, and she intended to grow them in Kansas. Eli listened to all of this and agreed to all of it with a genuineness that surprised him, because he had lived alone in that house for so long that he had ceased to notice its deficiencies. And now he saw them through Eleanor's eyes and found them not discouraging but promising, because a house with deficiencies that someone is planning to remedy is a house with a future. He painted the exterior in February, which was a remarkable thing to undertake in a Kansas February, and which required him to pick the 3 warmest days of the month and work quickly. He painted it white with dark green shutters around the windows, and when Eleanor saw it for the first time she stood in front of it with her hand over her mouth and said nothing for a long moment. "It looks like a home," she said finally. "It is one," he said. "It has been waiting to be one." She turned and looked at him with the full force of those green eyes and said, "Eli Calloway, I love you," which was the first time either of them had put those particular words in that particular order, and he felt them go through him like the first warm day after a long winter, recognizable and needed and immensely welcome. "I love you, Eleanor," he said, and he pulled her close in front of the freshly painted house in the cold February air, and held her there for a long moment while Scout watched from the paddock with ears forward, and the wind made everything around them still for a moment, the way wind sometimes does. The first Saturday of March 1883 arrived clear and cold, with just enough winter left in the air to make it crisp, and just enough spring beginning in the light to make it hopeful. Reverend Aldrich performed the ceremony in the Methodist church at noon, with most of Caldwell in attendance, and several families from the surrounding farms who had come in for the occasion. The church was full and warm and smelled of cedar, and the dried flower arrangements that Martha Hatch and Mrs. Garland had constructed together over the previous 2 weeks. Eleanor wore a dress of ivory wool that she had made herself with the help of Mrs. Aldrich, and the garnet ring on her finger and her mother's brooch at the neckline, and her hair was up the way it had been at the Thanksgiving dance, with the curling red dark strands around her face that always escaped, and that Eli had come to love with a particular personal affection. She walked down the aisle of the church alone because there was no one left to walk her, which she had mentioned to Eli once with a quiet matter-of-factness that had moved him more than any expression of open grief would have. She was not alone, though. She walked through a room full of people who had known her for 5 months and who had made her theirs, and she understood this as she walked, and her face was radiant with it. Not only the happiness of the day, but the gratitude of having arrived somewhere by accident and found herself precisely where she was supposed to be. Eli stood at the front of the church and watched her come, and he was not a man given to the kind of sentiment that required special occasion to surface. But on this particular morning, he was aware that everything that had come before, all of it, the years of solitude and the work and the loss, and the long contented enough bachelor's life that everyone in town had despaired of, all of it had been the long path to this moment. To this woman coming down this aisle toward him with her green eyes steady, and her hands quiet, and the garnet catching the winter light coming through the church windows. "You look beautiful," he said when she reached him, the same words as the Thanksgiving dance, and she smiled the same smile, real and warm and utterly her. Reverend Aldrich married them with words that were well chosen and not too long, which the congregation appreciated, and when Eli and Eleanor Calloway walked back down the aisle together, married, the whole of Caldwell erupted in the kind of noise that a town makes when it has been pulling for something and finally sees it arrive. The celebration afterward was at Cole Hatch's place, which was large enough to hold everyone, and there was food enough for twice the number present, and Red Haze played again, and the dancing went until after dark, and even the children were still awake at 8 o'clock, running between the hay bales in the Hatch barn while their parents danced. Eli danced with his wife, and the word wife felt astonishing and right in the same breath, like a key turning in a lock that you have been carrying the key for without quite knowing what it opened. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder during the last slow song of the evening, and he held her close, and they moved through the music in a comfortable silence that had everything in it. They drove home to the Calloway ranch that night under a sky full of March stars, the wagon moving easy on the road south of town, Scout walking at his own reliable pace, Eleanor tucked close against Eli's side with his coat around both of them against the cold. The prairie was quiet and enormous around them, and the ranch house, when they came up the approach road, sat white and solid in the starlight with the dark windows waiting for light. Eli lit the lamp in the kitchen and Eleanor put the kettle on, and they stood in the kitchen of their house together for the first time as people who lived there together, and the simplicity of it was the most extraordinary thing Eli had experienced in 28 years of living on this land. "We are home," Eleanor said. "We are," he said. Spring came to the Chikaskia River Valley the way it always did, not gently but with sudden conviction, the cottonwoods leafing out green and bright almost overnight, the wildflowers pushing up in the bottomland grass, the sky going back to its summer blue. Eleanor planted the kitchen garden in April with a thoroughness and method that indicated she had researched the optimal planting schedule for this region, which Eli found deeply charming, and she put in the rose bed along the front of the porch as she had planned, ordering the rose starts from a nursery in Kansas City, paying for them with particular care from her teaching wages, which she had insisted on maintaining separately as her own for exactly this kind of purpose. The roses were a rambling red variety, and she planted them with the same focus and love that she brought to her students and to everything that mattered to her, firming the earth around each plant with her hands in a way that was, Eli thought, watching her from the porch with his morning coffee, one of the most beautiful ordinary things he had ever seen. The school was flourishing. Eleanor had 12 students who had advanced substantially over the winter term, and 3 new ones who had started with the spring, including a 7-year-old girl from a Mexican family that had recently settled outside town, whose Spanish first language required Eleanor to find creative approaches to instruction that she described to Eli each evening, with the animated enthusiasm of someone solving a puzzle they find genuinely compelling. Summer arrived, and with it the cattle drives again, the big herds coming up from Texas on the Kishom Trail, the town filling up with drovers and their attendant energy, the long days of heat and work on the ranch. Eli worked the summer with the same consistent dedication as always, but came home to Eleanor every evening, to the house that was fully alive now, full of books and curtains, and the smell of cooking, and the sound of her voice reading aloud in the evenings from novels she had brought from Ohio, reading to him while he sat in the parlor chair after supper, which was a thing he had never had before, and which had become in a matter of months as necessary and natural as breathing. In July, Eleanor told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, standing by the window with the summer evening light behind her, and she watched his face with a careful attention, reading him the way she read everything, fully and precisely. Eli's face did something complex and complete. He stood up from the table and crossed to her and took her face in both his weathered hands and looked at her and said, "Eleanor," just her name, just the one word, and she understood it contained everything, the joy and the wonder and the particular awe of a man who has been alone a long time and finds that life keeps offering him more than he thought it was going to. "Are you happy?" she asked because she needed to hear it said. "I am more than happy," he said. "I do not have the right word for what I am." She smiled, and he held her, and the summer evening light lay over the Chikaskia bottomland, and the roses on the porch were blooming for the first time, the deep red opening up in the summer heat, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. The news went through Caldwell with predictable speed and was received with universal delight. Mrs. Garland cried when Eleanor told her, which Eleanor had expected, and for which she had brought a handkerchief. Colhatch said it was about time, and then looked like he wanted to take back the about time part as being somewhat impertinent but was not sure how, which Martha Hatch resolved by patting his arm and saying she was sure he meant it kindly. Eleanor continued teaching through the autumn term, which was not precisely expected, but which no one on the school board objected to, partly because the children's progress was evident and compelling, and partly because Colhatch had again made his views clear in advance. The pregnancy was not difficult. Eleanor was healthy and practical about it in the way she was practical about everything, visiting the town's physician, Dr. Lester Crane, who had come to Caldwell from Missouri 3 years prior, and who was a thoughtful and competent doctor who treated Eleanor with the professional respect she expected and received. She adjusted what needed adjusting in her physical activities as autumn deepened, and she kept teaching until the Christmas break, having trained her 2 oldest students as monitors who could keep the younger ones on task while she rested during the noon hour. Eli was attentive in the way that a man is attentive when someone he loves is carrying something precious and vulnerable, not hovering or anxious but present and steady, which was his natural quality applied to a new and paramount purpose. He was up early and back early from the range work. He took on extra ranch chores without mention, so that Eleanor would not feel compelled to continue the heavier domestic work when she was tired. He sat with her in the evenings and read to her when her eyes were too tired to read herself, working through the novels she loved, managing the reading with less dramatic flair than she brought to it, but with a sincerity that she told him she loved better. The baby came on a clear cold morning in late February 1884, which placed the birth just under a year from the wedding, and it was a boy, healthy and loud, with dark hair like his father and eyes that were as yet indeterminate but which Eleanor insisted were going to be green, which turned out to be correct within the first 2 months. They named him Thomas James Calloway. Thomas for Eleanor's father, whose memory she carried everywhere, and James for Eli's father, whose presence was still felt along the river and in the limestone of the bluffs, and in the way his son worked the land. The combining of those names into one small, loud, demanding person felt to both of them like the right thing, the honoring of what had come before, so that what was going forward could be built on it properly. Eli held Thomas James Calloway for the first time in the bedroom of the ranch house, with the February light coming gray and clean through the windows, and the sound of the wind off the prairie faint and continuous outside. And the feeling that went through him was one he could not have prepared for even if someone had told him it was coming. A love so complete and physical and immediate that it reorganized everything around itself the way a river reorganizes the landscape it runs through. Gradually and powerfully and entirely without asking permission. "Hello," he said to his son, very quietly. Thomas James blinked with the unfocused intensity of the newly arrived. Eleanor watched from the bed with the exhausted, brilliant face of someone who has just done something enormous and knows it. "He has your jaw," she said. "God help him," Eli said. Eleanor laughed, which was the first laugh after the long, hard hours of the birth, and it filled the room and the house and went out through the walls and into the February day where Scout was standing at the paddock fence with his ears forward, aware of something significant occurring, the way good horses sometimes are. Life on the Calloway Ranch in 1884 was fuller than it had ever been. The school, when Eleanor returned in the spring term, had a small arrangement with Mrs. Aldrich, who agreed to mind Thomas James during school hours, which worked well for everyone, and which Thomas James seemed to accept with the cooperative spirit of a child who had arrived in a family and found it satisfactory. Eli expanded the herd that spring, buying 20 additional head from a Texas seller who came through with the early drives, and he hired a hand for the first time. A steady young man of 20 named Andrew Farley, who had come up from the Indian Territory looking for honest work, and whom Eli found reliable and willing to learn. Andrew slept in the bunkroom that Eli fitted out in the barn, and he became part of the daily fabric of the ranch, with a naturalness that suggested the Calloway spread was ready to be bigger than one man. Eleanor's roses bloomed again that summer, fuller and more extravagant than the first year, climbing the porch posts the way she had hoped they would, and she stood on the porch in the early morning sometimes before the school day with Thomas James on her hip and the red roses around her, and the Chikaskia bottomland stretching out in the summer green, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a life that has been built by hand and choice from the raw materials of accident and courage. She had come here on the wrong train. She thought about that sometimes, in the way you think about a near miss that turned out to be a direct hit, with wonder and gratitude, and a kind of reverent understanding that the world had its own logic running underneath the logic of itineraries and schedules and conductors in Wichita who were unclear about which track was which. She had come here on the wrong train and found a schoolhouse full of children who needed her, and a community that took her in, and a man standing on a depot platform with honest dark eyes, and a hat he kept turning in his hands when he was thinking, who had carried her trunks and sat with her by the river, and told her about his father, and the way the land looked in every season, and asked her to dance and asked her to stay, and asked her to marry him with his hands open and his intentions plain. Which was the most trustworthy thing about him, and there was a great deal that was trustworthy about Eli Calloway. By 1885, the ranch had grown enough that Eli added a second hired hand, a man called Garcia whose full name was Roberto Garcia, and who had come from New Mexico with considerable experience in cattle and horses, and who spoke to the animals in a low, steady Spanish that seemed to work as well as anything. Roberto Garcia was a straightforward and dignified man who asked for fair pay and an honest work environment, and received both, and who became, over time, part of the extended family of the Calloway Ranch, eating Sunday supper at the main house sometimes when Eleanor set a plate for him, which she began doing regularly because she felt strongly that the men who worked the land with Eli were owed more than wages. Eleanor was aware, as a person of education and conscience, of the considerable injustices of the era. She knew that Roberto Garcia navigated the world of 1885 Kansas with burdens she did not carry, that the assumptions made about him in town required him to assert his dignity repeatedly in ways that no one should have to do repeatedly. She spoke of this to Eli, not with the expectation that they could fix everything, but with the conviction that what was in their power to do, they should do, and that what was in their power to do began with their own land and their own table. Eli agreed without qualification, because he was a man who had watched his own father treat every person who came to the ranch with the same basic regard regardless of where they came from or what the prevailing social current said about them, and because it was simply the right way to conduct a life, which Eli had always understood, and which Eleanor's directness had made plainer to articulate. Thomas James grew and grew with the particular velocity of small children on good land, walking at 10 months and talking with startling precision at 2 years, which Eleanor attributed to being read to from birth, and which Eli attributed to the fact that he had always talked to the child during the morning ranch rounds, explaining what he was doing and why, which seemed to have been received as instruction rather than simply as sound. The boy loved horses with an intensity that was partly genetic and partly the result of being set on Scout's back for the first time at 18 months, which Eli had done carefully, and with Eleanor standing 2 feet away ready to intervene, and which had produced in Thomas James an expression of absolute and total satisfaction. In the spring of 1886, when Thomas James was 2 years old and the roses on the Calloway porch were in their 3rd magnificent summer, and the ranch was running well, and the school had 27 students, and the Chikaskia ran clear and cold over the limestone, and the prairie sky was doing what it always did, being enormous and blue and inclusive, Eleanor told Eli she was expecting again. He was in the barn when she told him, brushing Scout down after the morning ride, and he turned and looked at her standing in the barn doorway with the spring light behind her, and he set down the brush and walked to her and kissed her, which was not the careful, considered thing of a man working out his response, but the immediate, honest thing of a man whose joy has a direct line to action. "Are you happy?" she asked, the same question as before. "Eleanor," he said, the same answer, just her name containing everything. She laughed. "I thought so," she said. The second child arrived in October of 1886, a girl this time, small and fierce, with Eleanor's red dark hair and Eli's dark eyes, and a set of lungs that Thomas James found very interesting, and that Scout could apparently hear from the paddock. They named her Clara Rose Calloway. Clara because Eleanor had always loved the name, and it had belonged to a beloved college professor, and Rose for the roses on the porch that had bloomed every summer, and that Eleanor intended to bloom every summer for the rest of her life on this ranch. Clara Rose grew up knowing herself to be entirely loved and entirely capable, which was the combination that Eleanor had received from her own father, and which she and Eli gave their daughter with the same deliberate intention. Thomas James took his role as older brother with a seriousness that occasionally required gentle correction, because his protectiveness was genuine but sometimes indistinguishable from bossiness, which Eleanor addressed with the same directness she brought to the classroom. The years moved through the ranch and the town the way years do when you are in the middle of a good life, not quickly because you are paying attention, but with a fullness that fills every interval. There were hard winters and good summers and a drought year in 1889 that tested the range and the herd and the family's reserves and found them sufficient. There were school board meetings and cattle market negotiations and the ongoing work of a working ranch and a working school. There were Sunday evenings with the Hatches and supper, sometimes with the Aldriches, and long conversations in the Calloway kitchen over coffee about everything from the children's education to the state of the cattle business to the books Eleanor was reading, and what Eli thought about them, which was always something because he had become, over the years, a reader himself, partly by Eleanor's example, and partly because the long winter evenings made it the best available use of the lamplight. In 1890, the school had 31 students, and Eleanor had trained a junior teacher, a young woman from Wichita named Alice Brentwood, who had come down on the correct train and been interviewed by Eleanor with the same precise attention that the school board had given Eleanor 8 years before. Alice Brentwood was good and earnest and learned quickly, and took the younger students with a genuine affection, which freed Eleanor to focus on the more advanced curriculum that the older students were now ready for. Thomas James Calloway at age 6 could ride a horse with a competence that made Roberto Garcia nod with approval, which was the highest praise available from Roberto Garcia. Clara Rose Calloway at age 4 had opinions about everything, and expressed them with a clarity and volume that suggested she had observed her mother's professional method and internalized it fully. The Calloway Ranch on the Chikaskia River in the autumn of 1890 was a different place from the bachelor's spread it had been in 1882. It was bigger, in herd and in hands and in the house itself, where Eli had added 2 rooms when Clara Rose arrived and another in 1889, when the original sitting room had become inadequate for the family's actual living requirements. The front porch had new railings, replacing the section that had wanted work since before Eleanor arrived. The kitchen garden was productive, and Eleanor's roses climbed the porch posts every summer in their deep red abundance. The bookshelf in the sitting room held 3 rows of books and was already insufficient for the current collection, which Eli had pointed out, and Eleanor had agreed, and which they were both still discussing as a planning matter. One October evening in 1890, the good, clear autumn kind, Eli and Eleanor sat on the porch after supper with the children in bed, and the night coming on over the prairie with its full complement of stars. The lamp inside the house cast a yellow rectangle on the porch boards. The crickets were still going, the last ones of the season. Scout was quiet in the paddock. The air smelled of earth and the last of the roses which Eleanor had not yet cut back for winter. "I have been thinking," Eleanor said. "Tell me," Eli said. She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the bottomland. 8 years ago I arrived at a train station I had never heard of, and I was stranded and lost, and a man I did not know helped me carry my trunks down a dusty street, and I thought, this is a complication I do not need, this is a delay, this is the wrong place. And now," Eli said. She turned and looked at him in the lamplit dark of the porch. This woman who had come on the wrong train and stayed because a school needed a teacher, and because of something she had seen in the honest brown eyes of a man with his hat in his hands and his intentions plain, and she looked at him with 8 years of marriage and 2 children and a ranch and a school, and a life built by daily deliberate choice between them. "And now," she said, "I cannot think of a single thing about my life that I would change." Eli reached over and took her hand the way he had been taking her hand for 8 years, with the easy certainty of something that is precisely where it is supposed to be. "Neither can I," he said. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the river, the sound of it low and familiar. The prairie spread out in its enormous night-quiet beauty, the same land it had always been, holding the same river, keeping the same stars. The Calloway Ranch sat solid and lit and full in the middle of it, as it would sit tomorrow and the season after and in all the years that remained, which were considerable and good. Thomas James would grow to take over the management of the North Pasture at 14, with a seriousness and competence that made Eli proud in a way he could not always find words for, but that Clara Rose, who was always more verbal about such things, described perfectly one Sunday afternoon by saying her brother was turning into their father, which was the greatest compliment she could think of, and which Thomas James received with embarrassed pleasure. Clara Rose would go to college in 1904, the same kind of college her mother had attended in Ohio, and would return to Kansas 2 years later with a teaching credential and a plan to build a second school in the county's growing southern district, which she eventually did, though not without the same petitioning and persisting that her mother had told her about from her own college years, which Clara Rose approached with an energy that those who knew Eleanor Voss Calloway recognized immediately. Roberto Garcia would work the Calloway Ranch for 20 years before returning to New Mexico to be near his aging parents, leaving with a generous wage, a good horse, and a sincere farewell dinner in the Calloway kitchen that included most of the people who mattered in Caldwell. He sent a letter every Christmas for the following 10 years, which Eleanor read aloud at the holiday table. Andrew Farley would marry the youngest daughter of the Hatch Ranch family and take up a homestead of his own 3 miles to the northwest of the Calloway spread, becoming a neighbor in the full close sense that neighbors in that country were, dependable and present and part of the same interlocking life. Red Hayes would play his fiddle at every dance and celebration in Caldwell for another 15 years before his hands finally told him they had done enough, at which point he declared himself retired and spent his remaining years listening to other people play, offering detailed technical criticism from his chair by the fire at the Drover's Rest, which by then had been properly repainted and re-signed, and had added a second floor, and was considered one of the finer establishments between Wichita and the Territory line. Colhatch would remain the most opinionated voice in every public discussion in Caldwell until he was well into his 70s, which the town accepted as part of its essential character, and Martha Hatch would remain the most competent and warm-hearted woman in the county without, as far as anyone could tell, ever having tried particularly hard to be either, which was perhaps the truest sign of both qualities. And Eli and Eleanor Calloway would remain on the Chikaskia River ranch for all the years that were given to them, working it and loving it and each other in the consistent, daily, unremarkable and extraordinary way of two people who found each other by complete accident and recognized immediately that the accident was actually a destination. On the porch in the October night of 1890, Eli held his wife's hand and looked at the same stars his father had looked at from this same piece of ground, and felt the full weight of a life that had become more than he had imagined it could be, not through any dramatic reversal or sudden fortune, but through the cumulative grace of one right thing after another. Starting with a Thursday morning in September 1882, when he had ridden scout into town for work gloves and heard a woman's voice on the depot platform saying, with clarity and composure and the faintest beginning of a smile, "This is not Dodge City," he had walked toward that voice. He would have walked toward it in any weather, on any terrain, in any year, because some things you know, not slowly and not after deliberation, but the way you know the ground underfoot and the weather in the clouds and the quality of a horse's character on the first ride, fully and without remainder. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder in the dark. The crickets went on with their business. The river ran where it had always run. The stars above the Kansas prairie were immeasurable and clear. The last cowboy in Caldwell without a wife had found his, and she had arrived on the wrong train, which turned out to be exactly the right one.